Okay, we're learning how to solve a literal equation, but it might be nice of me to stop and say, hey, what is this thing anyway? What is a literal equation? Well, most equations you've dealt with, 3x plus 2 equals 19, this just has one variable in it, and we're usually asked to solve for x. Well, lots of equations have more than one variable. Here's one that you might be familiar with. E equals mc squared. Okay. Well, that's got three different variables. Energy, mass. Well, c is not a variable. Actually, it's the speed of light. But at least it's got two variables, E and m. So we would call this a literal equation. Okay. And what we're going to be looking at is several different literal equations, and our goal is solving them. And what that means is getting a variable by itself. You'll notice that in this case, E is already by itself. So you might say, well, it's solved. Okay, but what if I want it solved for m? Okay. So the idea will be to change the equation around so that a different variable is by itself. If I write a plus b equals c plus d, that's a literal equation, but it's not solved for anything. Another word we might use is formula. This is not a formula. This equation right here is not a formula because it's not solved for a single variable. So this one is. E equals mc squared is a formula. A plus b equals c plus d is not a formula, so our goal would be to solve for whatever variable we're asked to solve for. Okay? So that's an introduction. Let's get started. Let's take a look at the equation d equals rt, and in this case, d is the distance that you might travel, r is a certain rate that you're traveling at, and t is the amount of time that you're spending traveling. For instance, if I know that I'm going at a rate of 60 miles an hour for 4 hours, it's pretty easy to tell that you're going to go 240 miles, 60 miles for every hour for 4 hours. So you'd multiply those two numbers together to get the distance. Well, sometimes you want to know something else, like what's my rate if I travel at 320 miles for 4 hours? Well, you could probably divide in your head and figure out that the rate is 80 miles per hour. Well, what we're being asked to do in this case is solve this equation, which I already solved for d, and let's say we're being asked to solve for r. So our goal is to get r by itself now. And what you'll do is look at this and say, well, how is r being affected? It's being multiplied by t. Well, if it's being multiplied by t and I want it to get it by itself, I'll just simply have to unmultiply by t. How do you unmultiply? You divide. Okay? And most people are aware that once you get t on top and bottom, you could cancel them. Well, be careful. Don't forget that if you divide one side of an equation by t, you have to divide the other side of the equation by t. Okay? So now notice that r is by itself now because the t's canceled out, and this side is now d divided by t. We've now solved that equation for r. Okay? Let's look at another one. This one stands for the simple interest formula, and I've got the variables described over here. Basically what it tells you is how much interest you will earn if you invest a certain amount of money at a certain interest rate for a certain number of years. So if you know these three numbers here, how much money you invested, it's called the principal. Multiply it by the rate, which is always as a decimal, so if it's a 5% interest, you type in 0.05 in your calculator, and then t for time. Well, they're going to ask us, for instance, to please solve for p. All right. Well, to solve for p, we're going to look up at the equation and say, you know what? P's not by itself how we want. It's being multiplied by r and multiplied by t. So look at each of those and say, well, how would I undo those things? How would I unmultiply by r? Well, how about divide by r? Wouldn't that cancel it off? Yeah. So you'd cancel those off. You'd have a p and a t equals, well, I divided the right side by r, so I have to divide the left side by r. So I'll write I over r. Well, p is still not by itself. What's happening? It's being multiplied by t. So let's divide by t. That'll cancel. And we can divide the other side by t by simply putting a t down below. So now p is by itself as you wanted, and you have I equals RT. So now if you wanted to ask the question, how much money do I have to invest so that I earn a certain amount of interest at a certain rate over a certain number of years, you can use this formula and solve it. Okay? So let's look at an equation now that looks a little bit more complicated, and we're going to be asked to solve for h. This formula, as it stands, calculates the volume of a pyramid. It's drawn over here, where the bottom is a square, the two sides are length are s, and the height of the pyramid from the top down to the very middle is h. So the formula says to get the volume, take the side lengths and square it, multiply by h, and then either divide it by 3 or multiply by 1/3. Either way, calculate a third of the s squared times h. Well, we're now being asked to solve for h. How do we go about that? Well, look at how all of these things are being attached. H has been multiplied by s squared, and it's been multiplied by 3. So let's start taking care of those things. Let's take care of that s squared. Since it was multiplied by s squared, we'll just divide by s squared, and that'll cancel out the whole thing. And, of course, divide the other side by s squared as well. Let's write down what we've got. We've got v over s squared equals 1/3 h. So h is not by itself, but it's closer. How do we deal with that 1/3? Well, it is being multiplied by 1/3, so we could divide by 1/3. And many of you know that when you divide by a fraction, you can divide by a fraction by multiplying by the reciprocal of the fraction. What's the reciprocal of 1/3? 3. So what I tell folks is, hey, if you just multiply by 3, that's going to cancel off the 1/3. Okay. Well, how do you multiply this by 3? You can just slap a 3 out there, I guess. Oftentimes what I'll write is 3 over 1. Since I'm multiplying a fraction here, I'll just write another fraction there, and then simplify this. 3 times v is 3v. 1 times s squared, of course, is s squared. Now you have your formula solved for h. And finally, here's one more. Suppose that I decide I'm going to buy some giant candy bars, and a Snickers costs $2 each, and a Butterfinger, being more valuable, of course, costs $3.50 each. Okay? These are good-sized candy bars, and T would tell me my total amount of money that this is going to cost me. So if I buy S Snickers bars at $2 each, and B Butterfingers at $3.50 each, here's my total. Well, suppose they asked us to solve, come on, computer, solve for B. So my goal is to get this by itself. Well, I've got a bunch of other stuff over here on the left side with the B that I don't want. So here's what I'll do. I'll look and say, B has been multiplied by 350, and we added this 2s out here. Well, your experience tells you you should take care of things that are added and subtracted first before you take care of things that are multiplied. We have to undo order of operations. So let's get rid of this s squared over here. Let's subtract it. I'm sorry, not s squared. This 2s from that side. That's going to get rid of it. Well, you know as well as I do, you can't subtract 2s from one side without subtracting it from the other. So I'll write minus 2s. Okay. And let's write what we've got left. 350b equals t. Well, wait a minute. How do I write this? T minus 2s. Well, they're not like terms. One's got a t on it, one's got an s on it. I can't combine them into one thing, so I'll just write it the way it says. T minus 2s. And we won't worry about trying to combine things. We'll just write it as one statement. Okay? Now, is b by itself yet? No. But it's closer. So we will deal with this multiplying by 350 by, as you might expect, dividing by 350. That'll cancel it out. What do I divide over here by 350? So I divided the left side by 350. Who do I divide by 350 over here? Well, how about the whole thing? Okay. Since you divided the whole left side by 350, just divide the entire right side by 350. Now, the 350's canceled off. I'm left with B equals T minus 2S equals, divided by 350. Okay. Now you have a formula that would tell you, if I know the total amount of money that I want to spend, and I want a certain number of Snickers bars, how many Butterfingers can I buy? All right, that's a good introduction. Thank you.